We've long understood that Russia's advances in Ukraine have been built on a lot of broken and burned out metal, but every war of attrition has at least two sides. And just as with the Russians, we've sometimes seen very clear signs of the strain. Whether that be the fielding of ad hoc vehicles and some fine and not so fine examples of shedcraft, or Ukrainian figures, including Zelensky himself, admitting the country just doesn't have the military equipment to hit its force generation goals. Recently, I did a video looking at Russian heavy equipment losses, what they still had in storage, and how long, if the current rate of attrition holds, their remaining equipment stockpiles might last. Today, as promised, we're going to reverse the question and look at Ukraine, examining the relationship between losses and replacements, how long various already announced aid packages might be sufficient to maintain the different equipment categories, and what the potential effect might be if the new US presidential administration decides to cut down or not cut down on military assistance to Kyiv. To do that, I'll try and follow a pretty similar structure as we did with the Russian episode. Basically summarise the Ukrainian equipment resupply model, as well as some of the assumptions we're going to be relying on. So our process for preparing Ukrainian estimates basically follows the same rules we used for Russian ones. Then we'll walk through various platform types, estimating inflow and outflow figures, including visually confirmed losses, foreign aid, domestic production, etc., and demonstrate how we might go stress testing those estimates against Russian data. Finally, we'll zoom out for a bit of a big picture view, contrasting the Ukrainian equipment position with the Russian one and how both sides might be placed for 2025. As you might expect, that means a lot of everyone's favourite things, stats, graphs and projections, so I hope you enjoy. However, before we jump into it, a word from a sponsor. Well, the new year's here, and you can bet it's going to be an eventful one. And so if you're tracking through the news headlines of 2025, it might sometimes be difficult to know if you're seeing the story from all the angles or if critical information is being conveniently left out or de-emphasised. Look at the recent coverage, for example, of Ukraine's decision not to renew its gas transit agreement with Russia. Here, some headlines might highlight just how big of an economic and political setback this might be for Russia, while shockingly enough, Russian sources tend to push any suggestion this is bad for Moscow out of the headline, and instead focus on the potential economic impact on the European Union and Ukraine. The tool being used to click between the various headlines here is long-term sponsor Ground News. And what it allows you to do by drawing on more than 50,000 sources around the world is quickly see how stories are being reported, while at the same time also providing extra useful context, like ownership information and factuality ratings based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. It also has a range of other useful features, things like the blind spot feed, and what that more or less attempts to do is surface the kind of stories that might often be underreported in the type of media that you ordinarily consume, helping you stay aware of what others might be seeing and discussing. And in an era that feels increasingly dominated by online echo chambers, that kind of feature might feel like a useful step in the right direction. So if you are interested in potentially adding this tool to your online toolkit in 2025, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on Ground News Vantage plan, which is the plan I use and actually just renewed for another year. So with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so if we're trying to understand how the Ukrainian military's supply of heavy equipment can hold up in the face of a long attritional war, we need to be able to understand and estimate the inflows and outflows. The outflow, aka the burn rate or amount of equipment they're losing or consuming, is something we've looked at heavily before but generally relies on visually confirmed loss data with a couple of extra assumptions and loadings. And as we'll see in a second, our method for estimating that is very similar to what we did with Russia. Where there's a bit more of a difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians is in the inflows. Because while Russia and Ukraine have relatively similar ways of getting access to more equipment, the relative importance of those methods differs. Ukraine began the war with an equipment park that was, yes, smaller than Russia's, but still one of the largest in Europe. But pretty quickly it became apparent, both to replace losses and to stand up new units, Ukraine was going to need a lot more. In 2022, one of the largest, and depending on your assumptions, potentially the largest source of replacement material was actually Russian donations. The quadruple figure number of armoured vehicles and heavy equipment pieces left behind in various goodwill gestures. As the lines began to stabilise in 2023 and 2024, though, we saw a massive reduction in Russian military aid to Ukraine, with the baton being passed to new aid providers, primarily amongst Ukraine's allies, especially as taboos against certain types of weapon systems began to drop away. Hope you're all doing okay during that nuclear apocalypse that inevitably followed the supply of Western-made battle tanks and long-range missiles, by the way. But ultimately we did see a lot of those red lines crossed, and as a result, Ukraine's allied suppliers became responsible for a majority of the country's equipment inflows. And unlike, for example, North Korean or Iranian aid to Moscow, a lot of this aid is comparatively easier to estimate because it's publicly disclosed. The final element, which has become increasingly important recently, but which is generally harder to measure, is Ukrainian domestic output. And within that, I include both truly domestic Ukrainian programs and also hybrid arrangements. either where foreign companies have decided to set up production in Ukraine itself, or foreign governments have decided to bankroll the production of Ukrainian military equipment in Ukraine. It's generally understood and admitted by the Ukrainian government that, just as with Russia, Ukraine's domestic arms industry can't produce enough truly new equipment to make up all of its losses or fulfill all of its requirements. But I still think we need to work up even rough estimates where we can, given it does potentially play a pretty significant role in how long the modelling suggests Ukraine is able to keep up with any given rate of attrition. And so if we're summarising the key difference here between the work we did with Russia and what we're about to do with Ukraine, it's that in Russia's case, the failure point that we were most concerned with was Russia's stockpile of old vehicles suitable for reactivation. Given that Ukraine's supply situation is much less reliant on that particular method, and it doesn't have the same stockpiles Russia does anyway, we'll instead spend a lot more time focusing on what's been pledged by various foreign suppliers and how the inflows we're aware of contrast against observed losses. To do that, given I don't have access to reliable classified briefings from both the Ukrainian and Russian ministries of defense, we're going to have to make some assumptions about losses and resupply, so here they are up front. As normal in most system categories, we'll be starting with visually confirmed losses as the baseline. As discussed in the past, that's necessarily an imperfect science, given that even when visual evidence appears to exist, it might end up being a Photoshop, like this Abrams that apparently got the Chrono Tank upgrade package because it was able to both teleport and time travel from Iraq in order to be destroyed again in Ukraine, or you might have cases of duplicate entries making it into the list, or particularly convincing decoys. This mock-up Ada Lancet loitering munition, for example, with the image on the right highlighting why it's often so important to try and get aftermath footage, not just video that runs up to the point of the initial hit and explosion. I think at least for frontline systems, visually confirmed loss data serves as an adequate soft floor. And given that a preponderance of factors probably point towards visual counts being undercounts rather than overestimates, just as with the Russia episode, I'm going to be applying a 20% premium on top of the visually confirmed data to try and account for imputed losses. Think vehicles that are simply worn out beyond repair, lost in non-combat conditions, or systems that are lost but don't find themselves photographed or videoed and then uploaded to the internet. My source for a majority of that visually confirmed loss data this episode will be the Oryx dataset, but just to add a little extra robustness to our analysis, given that Oryx is operated by administrators generally living in the Western world, I'll also demonstrate how to do a reconciliation or check against what is probably the premier Russian visually confirmed loss database. Then there's another big assumption I'm going to make in the name of conservatism that absolutely doesn't work in Ukraine's favour. Different countries supplying military aid to Ukraine handle the announcement of that aid differently. Some, like Germany, in true Teutonic style, provide very detailed public accounting, as in down to the individual rifle and medkit level of reporting. Others are more vague, saying they're sending a certain type of system without specifying how many, while others are just saying they're providing military aid and offer no further details. And so in order to be as conservative as possible, unless a country has specified how many of a thing that it's sending to Ukraine, I'm going to treat that number as 0. Also, if they do give a number but it's a range, I'm going to take the absolute bottom of the range. Dozens of tanks, for example, would get plugged into these estimates as 24 tanks. So keep in mind, whenever we're going through foreign military assistance to Ukraine, that I'm carving out a whole bunch of stuff just because we can't be exactly sure on it. The final assumption, as with the episode on Russia, is that loss rates are going to remain constant. Obviously, you'd actually expect losses to change based on the number of vehicles that were still available, but to keep this simple and more importantly consistent, we're going to be drawing straight lines and following them all the way to the end. And so with the preamble and caveats out of the way, let's talk metal. Okay, so just as we did with Russia, the first category I want to look at today is infantry fighting vehicles. These may not always get as much attention as the main battle tanks, but they've proven to be valuable multi-purpose tools in Ukraine, carrying out duties from infantry fire support, transportation, medical evacuation, and even, if you're talking about systems like Bradley, as anti-tank or armoured vehicle hunters. For the purpose of our work today, we'll often be cutting the Ukrainian IFV fleet into 3 components. Your typical Soviet and Russian systems like the BMP series, truly Ukrainian domestically produced systems like the BTR-3 and BTR-4, with the BTR-4 in particular having proven itself to be a pretty dangerous vehicle with that remote weapon station, and which are particularly useful indicators if you're trying to estimate Ukrainian production levels, because unlike a lot of other systems that may have been captured from the Russians, whenever we see a BTR-4 appear in the loss data, we know it could only have come from one place, a Ukrainian factory. Finally, we've seen Ukraine receive a number of different families of Western infantry fighting vehicles to augment its own stocks. The American Bradley, the Swedish CV-90, the German Marder, the Polish Rosomark, all of them fit into this category, the introduction of which has likely helped keep the Ukrainian IFV fleet several more steps away from the grave, and the Ukrainian maintainers who have to keep them running, perhaps occasionally looking longingly at it. If we're trying to map inflows into the Ukrainian force then, with infantry fighting vehicles, it's generally fairly clean. Soviet-era systems coming into the force are likely to be either Russian contributions or those from Ukraine's allies. NATO-type systems are obviously coming from NATO countries, while new BTR-3s or BTR-4s would represent Ukrainian production. But before we try and derive those inflows, let's look at outflows first. What we've seen with visually confirmed Ukrainian IFV losses to date is a change in both quantity and makeup over time. Year by year, losses have generally trended downwards. In 2022, with the shock of the original Russian offensive and then major Ukrainian counteroffensives, Ukrainian IFV losses just of types that we can identify, so leaving out unidentified units for a moment, crossed over the 400 mark. But then fewer than 400 were recorded lost between the end of 2022 and the end of 2023, albeit with some very significant spikes during the year, for example, during the Ukrainian southern offensive. Not only did that campaign fall well short of its objectives, it also drove a significant uptick in Ukrainian equipment losses. Because it turns out, if you're trying to punch through multi-layered minefields and prepared defensive positions without adequate engineering equipment or long-range missiles with which to suppress opposing attack helicopters, then all the bravery in the world isn't going to stop you losing a lot of metal. The losses in 2024 then were very roughly about a quarter lower than they had been in 2023. The why of that reduction, though, is very difficult to pin on a single factor. We know Ukraine didn't launch offensives on the same scale as in 2022 or 2023. We know there may have been changes in tactics on both sides, or the Ukrainians might just be operating fewer IFVs than previously. But while it's hard to be sure about the size of the current Ukrainian IFV fleet, we can be a little bit more confident, I think, about its composition. In 2022, identified Ukrainian IFV losses were split up very roughly 80-20. 80% Soviet or Russian systems, 20% domestically produced Ukrainian ones. In 2023, the new kids on the block, the NATO systems, seized about a 20% market share, while the Soviet category shed about 10 percentage points, and the Ukrainian one basically halved. Finally, in 2024, the share of Ukrainian systems in the lost data appears to have mostly stabilised, although there was another small decline, but the major swing was actually the NATO IFVs, gaining another roughly 10 percentage points to nearly a third of all losses, with most of those gained percentage points coming out of the Soviet and Russian system category. If this was the only piece of data we had to work with, it would point towards the Ukrainian IFV fleet that's still majority made up of things like BMP 1s, 2s and their various equivalents, but where NATO standard systems now make up a significant minority of the force, while the domestic Ukrainian systems are struggling to tread water. Unfortunately, however, while visually confirmed losses might give us some pretty significant clues as to the composition of the Ukrainian IFV fleet over time, we absolutely can't trust them to be a perfect indicator. In both Russian and Ukrainian service, different types of vehicles are not uniformly distributed amongst different units, partly because if you tried to hand the maintainers in a single mechanised brigade 6 Bradleys, 3 Martyrs, 2 Rosser Marks, 6 BMPs, a couple of CV90s, and some ad hoc creations that someone's uncle worked up in their backyard, you'd have a recipe for a fantastic sitcom and a terribly ineffective military unit. But because vehicles are concentrated in particular units, the number of losses we see in those vehicle types can often be tied to how those units are being used. We're also not factoring in survivability, which can matter given we're counting damaged and abandoned vehicles, not just thoroughly destroyed ones. If you're using a vehicle like the BMD-4 that has a tendency to self-atomize if it's so much as tickled by an opposing anti-armor munition, then it's almost certainly only going to appear in the lost data once, when it's destroyed. But if you have vehicles with a propensity to just be damaged and knocked out, and potentially recovered, repaired, put back into service, and then damaged again, it might survive long enough to be included in the lost data a second or even third time. Ironically meaning that potentially the more survivable a vehicle, the more on-paper losses you might suffer. That said, with all those caveats in place, I think the next question is to try and compare estimated outflows and estimated inflows. The chart you can see on screen here cuts the data for 2022, 2023, and 2024, and for each year it shows those outflows in red, visually confirmed losses, and also that 20% imputed losses loading for just vehicles breaking down or being lost in ways that aren't visually confirmed, and then the estimated inflows in blue on the top. 30% of all vehicles captured, plus announced committed resupply. What that suggests is that in 2022, Ukraine likely lost more IFVs from its fleet than it gained back. Vehicles publicly committed by allies wouldn't have been enough to replace even half of the visually confirmed losses, let alone with that 20% extra. What likely helped take the edge off then was the massive amount of equipment captured from the Russians. Even though we're assuming here that Ukraine needed to capture 3 infantry fighting vehicles for the Russians in order to make 1 operational, that still made Russia about as important as an IFV donor to the Ukrainian military in 2022 as all of the Western allies combined. In 2023, though, things completely changed. Captured vehicles became a very minor factor as the war became much more static, and allied commitments expanded to significantly exceed visually confirmed losses. meaning that if every one of those vehicles was being delivered, you would expect them to be enough not just to cover the losses suffered in 2023, but to help offset some of those suffered in 2022. That pattern would then continue, at least on paper, in 2024. What this might initially suggest is a Ukrainian IFV fleet that shrank in 2022 and then slowly recovered over the course of 2023 and 2024. The problem, however, is that picture is only true if all committed aid has already been delivered, which it hasn't. The team at Oryx maintain rough estimates of what percentage of equipment pledged has actually been delivered, based on things like public announcements and also just what we see appear in the field. And if you split the data like that, you end up with something like this. IFV losses of just over 1,300, inflows of just under 1,300, and 335 in the pipeline. That would suggest the fleet is actually smaller than it was in February 2022, but with a lot of runway to regenerate. What that's still leaving out, though, is Ukrainian domestic production. In terms of what we see first, I think there are at least two major clues. The first clue comes through pretty clearly in the chart I've got up on screen now, and what it shows is the visually confirmed losses by period of two indigenous Ukrainian designs, BTR3 and BTR4. And the clue here, I think, is the change in the ratio between the two. In 2022, there were roughly 2 BTR4s lost for every BTR3. In 2023, that number was about 2.8 to 1, and in 2024, more than 11 to 1. The 2022 ratio passes the pub test, given the estimates we have about the pre-war fleet sizes, but the 2023 and 2024 figures are a bit more wonky, unless that is you factor in that one of these fleets might be regenerating, while the other isn't. BTR3 was sold fairly widely around the world, but is no longer in active production. BTR4 is. That's further confirmed by the fact that over the course of the war, we've also seen new Ukrainian units receive the BTR4, with I think the latest example being the Ukrainian 58th Motorized in late 2024. There's also an interview out there with a junior Ukrainian officer talking about the BTR4s being operated by another formation, the 56th Brigade, noting that their vehicles were marked as having been manufactured in 2023. So unless there's an elaborate hoax here where existing formations are having their vehicles taken away, repainted and remarked with new production years and then given to new units, presumably for reasons, there's some circumstantial evidence here of a production line capable of maintaining existing BTR4 using formations and slowly equipping new ones. Public statements by Ukrainian government officials on the topic are a bit mixed. Piecing things together, it appears the most likely scenario is that in 2022, a number of systems were pieced together relatively quickly using parts that had already been produced and could be rapidly finished. Then there was a slump to the point where production of BTR4s might only have been one a month at some points, before output levels began to re-expand and recover. Doing some back-of-the-envelope math against all those assumptions yields an estimated production value likely in the low triple digits. But to be as conservative as possible, we'll estimate the Ukrainian production of BTR4s at 100 since February 2022, while also assuming they haven't produced any other new IFVs or reactivated any old ones from storage. Despite the fact that, particularly in the latter case, I think we have fairly strong evidence to the contrary. That gives us a chart that looks more like this one, with the Ukrainian IFV fleet that's very broadly treading water, so to speak, but with the future inflow of new production and pledged IFVs that, if delivered, and assuming no further losses, would be, on paper, more than enough to make up the attrition suffered so far. But before I jump into more about what that means and how long that resupply pipeline might be sufficient to keep Ukraine's mechanised forces in the fight, as I mentioned at the start, I really do want to flag and test one dependency here. We're assuming that the visually confirmed losses, specifically from the databases I'm using, are useful as a soft floor estimate. And because I believe on this channel it's very important to explain not just what I believe is likely, but why I believe it's likely, I just want to spend a couple of minutes demonstrating how you might test and sense check that data, in particular by comparing these potentially pro-Ukrainian sources to more pro-Russian ones. I've talked about the basic logic of using visually confirmed loss databases like Warspotting or Oryx before, because even though they can't be perfect, requiring actual evidence for claims helps keep them more anchored to reality. One objection I've constantly seen raised, however, is that in the end these databases are run by people. Those people, like all humans, are going to have particular biases. Now, obviously, just because someone is biased doesn't mean they can't carry out a pretty much objective analysis. In most scenarios, if you design a fair and robust method and then stick to it, you should get fair and robust results. But if you're a reasonably skeptical person, you might quite reasonably want to know whether those biases might potentially be skewing results. Maybe images are being deliberately misidentified as Russian rather than Ukrainian, or images of Ukrainian losses aren't being included at all. That's a reasonable question to ask, but in order to figure out whether or not it's likely happening, you need a comparator. One option would be to look at the figures put out by both sides' ministries of defence estimating their opponents' losses. But if history is any guide here, generally speaking, during a war, it isn't a question so much whether or not a government will overestimate and overclaim opposing losses, it's by how much. And so for the sake of consistency, I neither use Ukrainian MOD claims on Russian equipment losses, which are likely exaggerated, nor do I use Russian MOD claims as to Ukrainian losses, which in many cases are literally impossible, with the total claims now having reached 652 fixed-wing aircraft, 283 helicopters, 20,492 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles, 1,500 MLRS systems, and 20,465 field artillery guns and mortars. Those are the kind of numbers where you're claiming to have destroyed the entire opposing military, all of the equipment it's been sent, all of the equipment it's been pledged but not yet sent, and then some more besides, at least in some systems categories. And so instead, when we're trying to sense check data, we probably want a little less Moscow Mike and more something that's as close as possible in terms of method, but which isolates out as much as possible the factors we might be concerned about, like the bias of the operators. So instead, we can jump over to something like Lostarmour, which is a Russian-run visually confirmed loss database. It's run by Russians, published by Russians, and it only tracks Ukrainian losses, not Russian ones. In part, one imagines because that aligns with Russian government expectations on the matter, and going against those expectations may correlate with your chance of becoming a premature probate case. It's one of the big reasons, however, that I can't use this as a default source. A lot of this analysis is going to be relative, so you really need a baseline source that tracks both sides using the same methodology. To sense check our base data though, this will work fine. The methods between the sites are slightly different, but the basic concept is the same. Gather together images and video of claimed Ukrainian losses and put them into a database. If bias was a major problem in the sources we were using, causing lots of deliberate loss misidentification, duplicate inclusion, etc., we should probably expect our Russian-run database to include a lot more Ukrainian losses than our more pro-Ukrainian ones. So for the infantry fighting vehicle category, feel free to pause the video and write down your prediction. Across the main vehicle types we're looking at, what's the percentage difference between the pro-Russian and the pro-Ukrainian database? I'll give you a second. Yeah, sorry, it was kind of a trick question, because the Oryx estimates for Ukrainian IFV losses are actually higher than the Lostarmour ones. For most vehicle types, the gaps are relatively small, which might suggest that for the most part, both these databases are feeding from the same basic pool of available videos and photographs. And because there is no kill like overkill, and I know that some of you enjoy the occasional glance beneath the hood here, I thought I'd quickly dig a little deeper and actually demonstrate that. I don't want to turn a YouTube video into me manually reconciling hundreds of images, but the pool of CV90 losses barely crosses into the double digits, and so I went through the CV90 losses in both databases. The goal here was basically to check for alignment. If these were basically echo chambers, one pulling from pro-Russian data and one only pulling from pro-Ukrainian data, we wouldn't expect a huge amount of crossover between the entries. Similarly, if there was significant bias pushing in opposite directions between the two sources, you probably wouldn't expect to find what I found. A bunch of entries that got pretty close to being identical reprints. A Lostarmour CV90 hit on the 24th of August 2023, is also an Oryx CV90 hit on the 26th of August 2023, right down to one of the videos being used as evidence being exactly the same. Lostarmour CV90, 19 December 2023, Oryx CV90, 23rd December 2023. Lostarmour tagged this CV90 to 29 September 2024, but this time Oryx beat them to publication, marking it 18 September 2024. Here it doesn't take an image specialist to recognise that's the same vehicle from a slightly different angle, put up on both sources, 2 days apart. By now you probably get the picture, but why be illustrative when you can be practically exhaustive? So here you go, another matched vehicle. This one managed to find itself onto official Russian news apparently, given the watermark. Lostarmour image on the top, Oryx image on the bottom, with the only real difference being the colour of the bounding box. This one has a date match, comes from the same source, and it's very clear from the position of the vehicle relative to the other features like the trees and the track around it that this is in fact the same vehicle. Here, Lostarmour probably wins by having the more high-definition image up 3 days earlier than Oryx does, but unless someone decided to clear Rec 1 and then burn down a second CV90 in exactly the same position, in exactly the same way, these are the same vehicle. Here we have two almost identical frames for a September 2024 loss, and here we even have identifying stickers on the windshield of the vehicle that the person taking the photo was in. So mark that up as the same, late October 2024 loss. My point is not that the more pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian sources are exactly the same. In the end, all of the major visually confirmed loss databases have their own distinct rules and what they'll accept or reject as evidence. The Oryx database, for example, includes this image as evidence of a CV-90 being captured by Russian forces in the Luhansk region, because it shows a bunch of Russians with a new CV-90 that doesn't match any others in the database. But I didn't see that image appear in the Lostarmour dataset. Meanwhile, there can be other cases where the rules applied by Oryx or War Spotting might discard examples that could be included in other sources. The Oryx team, for example, is pretty firm on the need for aftermath footage. That is, it's not enough to just see the strike on something. You have to see evidence the strike was effective. And that means that by itself, a video like this one might not be included. What it shows is a technique we've seen used by some Ukrainian drone operators, where you take a small drone equipped with an RPG warhead, specifically a shaped charge RPG warhead, and then you ram it into the side of an artillery gun barrel. When it works, what that technique results in is that explosively formed penetrator boring a small hole through the gun barrel, leaving very little in the way of obviously visually apparent damage, but taking the gun completely out of service. This video, which appears to show the warhead contacting the barrel and then the drone losing signal, wouldn't be enough by itself to constitute aftermath footage. Some sources might say it's a case of near enough is good enough, but the team at Oryx would want to see something more, like a follow-up video taken by another drone showing very clearly that hole has been punched, specifically one that's more barrel break than muzzle break, and that as a result, this gun is done. Funnily enough, it's actually possible for aftermath footage to go too far in the other direction. In the image you're seeing on screen now, for example, there was originally a vehicle of some kind, presumably, in the centre of that crater, but given the only thing left is an increase in the heavy metal content of the surrounding soil, there's really no hope of identifying even the broad category of vehicle that might have been involved. So while this is obviously a case of a lost vehicle, from the point of view of the databases, it isn't, unless some other bit of evidence surfaces to give a clue as to what was there before. None of those attempts at rigour make any of these datasets perfect, and that's not my contention. Instead, it's that for the moment, they're the best we have. And at least from a statistical perspective, I'd argue that any evidence for systemic bias in the dataset is very weak. Obviously, I won't now repeat this exercise for every equipment category we go through, but for those of you who appreciate attempts to increase transparency and accuracy in information that's put out, I thought you'd appreciate that brief detour. So if we take all of that data as a given, let's talk very rough timelines. Depending on the assumptions you make and how you round, if you look at the data between December 2023 and January 2025, you get a Ukrainian IFV loss rate in the visually confirmed data of very approximately 1 per day, 80 to 100 IFVs per quarter. One of those assumptions, of course, is how many IFVs the Ukrainians are producing domestically during that time, so feel free to use your own. If we then take the estimated remaining announced pipeline of foreign deliveries of IFVs, roughly 335 at time of recording, that'd be enough to cover somewhere between 3 and 4 quarters of losses, barring any additional pledges. That's not the point where the Ukrainian IFV fleet would go to zero. It would be a point where the replacements were no longer sufficient to maintain the strength of the force, on paper. If we assume that more of those vehicles have already been delivered than has been openly announced, that will decrease that timeline, but it'll also increase the strength of the current force, which would in turn suggest the force has to decay more once the pipeline runs dry in order to reach any given level of reduced strength. So it's basically a wash. If we were looking to characterise the state of the Ukrainian IFV fleet based on the data we have then, it would probably go something like this. The total number of operational or near-operational IFVs in the Ukrainian inventory probably isn't that far removed from what it was back in February 2022. A lot hinges based on your assumptions around the reactivation rates of captured vehicles or your imputed loss rate, or how many systems you suspect have already been delivered versus how many are still in the pipeline. But to put it another way, this is a force which is very unlikely to have either halved in strength or doubled in strength over the last 3 years. There are probably 2 things we can assume have happened to the force, one of which is good from a Ukrainian perspective, the other bad, with the first being that the average quality of the force has likely increased significantly since February 2022, as heavily armed, quite capable vehicles like Bradleys and CV-90s have taken more and more fleet share from much older vehicles like BMP-1. On the other hand, even if the force was actually larger than when it started, the ratio of the number of vehicles available compared to the number of brigades that need them has probably deteriorated significantly. The Ukrainian ground forces, TDF and National Guard, have a lot more mechanised brigades now than they did back in February 2022. In order to maintain the same ratio between equipment and troops then, they would have needed a massive increase in the number of IFVs, which doesn't really appear to have materialised. Even if there's a dearth of new announcements, actually breaking down the Ukrainian IFV fleet, demilitarising it in line with Russian objectives, would likely take considerably longer, something which meshes quite uncomfortably with the timelines we calculated when looking at Russia's equipment reserves. But at the same time, Ukraine has no real prospects in the near to medium term of receiving enough vehicles to enable it to re-equip existing formations, generate new units, and aggregate advantages in the way they would probably prefer. And you could argue that's probably fairly consistent with a lot of Ukraine military aid efforts overall. And to help illustrate that trend, it's time to talk tanks. After nearly 3 years of fighting, it's pretty clear the war in Ukraine hasn't given us the end of the tank so much as the birth of the very cautious tank, a battlefield where mobile protected firepower is still very much valued, but one where tank tactics and tank protection schemes have had to evolve to match the reality of any 20-year-old with a controller and a VR headset becoming a potential anti-tank threat. As we've previously discussed, Ukraine began the war primarily dependent on various versions of the old Soviet T-64. And luckily for Ukraine, unlike in many other equipment categories, they also inherited a lot of the old Soviet T-64 stockpile and the related industrial infrastructure, with the city of Kharkiv basically being the industrial home for the T-64 tank. Over the years since independence, Ukraine had experimented with armoured development and coming up with new modernisation packages for older Soviet vehicles, but compared to the BTR-3s and BTR-4s in the IFV fleet, these were only ever a very small proportion of Ukraine's available tanks. Instead, the tank fleet today can basically be cut into 3 categories. T-64s which have been built, modernised or reactivated in Ukraine, other Soviet and Russian designs, either left over from the Soviet Union or captured from the Russians, and also several hundred NATO-type tanks spread across multiple categories. That includes both comparatively modern designs that probably have a qualitative advantage on the Ukrainian battlefield, like the Leopard 2A6, as well as much older systems that are probably mostly there just to make up the numbers, like the old Leopard 1s. And to understand how those inflows have changed the overall composition and state of Ukraine's MBT fleet, we need to pivot over to the loss data. This chart shows the claimed Ukrainian visually confirmed tank losses across a couple of selected categories. I've left out unknowns and a couple of the smaller ones. And once again, it's Oryx, the non-Russian source, that gives a higher estimate of Ukrainian losses, roughly 940 to 840. The pattern does reverse with some tank types. Lostarmour claims more destroyed Abrams, Challengers, Leopard 1s and T-55s. But that's more than compensated for by Oryx having a higher claim number for the most common Ukrainian tank type, which is of course the T-64. Once again though, probably a decent indicator that our chosen source isn't trying to sweep Ukrainian losses under the rug, and we can safely move on to the next bit of analysis. If you break those losses up both by our chosen type categories and by year, you get the chart on screen now. It shows the Ukrainian tank fleet had its highest losses in 2022, around 400 MBTs, before following a downward trend to closer to 275 in 2023, and just above 250 in 2024. That's broadly compatible both with the raw numbers we saw in the IFV category, and also the pattern of new NATO equipment becoming increasingly important from 2023 onwards. Through to the end of 2022, about 70% of Ukrainian tank losses were T-64s, and about 30% were various Soviet and post-Soviet types. Then in 2023, as we saw a lot of T-64s lost, while at the same time a bunch of NATO armour and captured Russian armour began to enter service, the share of T-64s in the overall losses fell to about 40%, NATO armour made up just over 10%, and non-T-64 Soviet-era designs, either supplied by Ukraine's various allies or captured from the Russians, grew to make up roughly half of the overall picture. In 2024, though, things got interesting. T-55s, T-72s, T-80s and their equivalents actually became rarer in the data again. The same thing happened with the higher-end Leopard 2s, many of which had been used in the Ukrainian Southern Offensive in 2023. Meanwhile, 3 vehicles started to become more common: the M1 Abrams, the Leopard 1, and the T-64, which is a fascinating observation and a pretty useful clue, because Ukraine's generally done a pretty good job of hoarding most of the world's T-64 supply. The Russians did have some of them in storage, but have used them in Ukraine only in relatively small numbers. And unlike, for example, T-72s, Ukraine's various allies didn't have a bunch of T-64s that they could hand over. And so you have a situation where even as new foreign tanks continue to flow into the force, the vehicle that appears to have grown in importance the most is Ukrainian. For the overall comparison of losses versus resupply over the course of those 3 years, I have this chart here. What it shows at a glance is that even though 2022 was the worst year for Ukraine in terms of tank losses, it was probably also the best in terms of tank inflows. The very roughly 400 vehicles pledged by Ukraine's various allies in that year wouldn't have been quite enough to replace all the visually confirmed losses, especially not when you include that 20% loss premium. But Ukraine captured so many bloody tanks from the Russians in 2022 that even if you assume that only a third of them could be made operational, they still would have been enough to push the overall force into mild net growth. In 2023, captures fell off, but pledged resupply actually increased slightly, while losses fell considerably. And so once again, the Ukrainian tank fleet would have gone through mild growth in 2023. In 2024, though, newly pledged commitments fell considerably, less than 200 over the course of the period I looked at. And according to our method, that would have been enough to push the Ukrainian force into a deficit for the year of more than 100 tanks, basically balancing out some, but not all, of the paper growth we saw in 2023. And if you're wondering why the loss data might look slightly different here than in the previous slides, by the way, it's because now that we're not cutting by type, I can afford to bring in the unknowns, featuring not just tanks that had a bad day, but those that had a very bad day. But of course, there's one major potential omission from this chart: Ukrainian production and reactivation. Now, originally in the media, there was a lot of optimism around this idea that Ukraine had plenty of T-64 tanks in storage and wasn't anywhere close to running out. Hence headlines like, quote, "Ukraine isn't anywhere close to running out of T-64 tanks," end quote. And then later, as the war dragged on, we saw more pessimism. Quote, "Ukraine is going to run out of T-64 tanks," end quote. Except those articles were actually written in the reverse order. Ukraine is going to run out of T-64 tanks is an article from 2023, and Ukraine isn't anywhere close to running out of T-64 tanks is an article from 2024 by the same author. Part of the difference in assessment appears to be the growing realization as the war continued that Ukraine was actually doing a pretty good job of pulling tanks out of conservation, and then in almost Russian style, taking vehicles that in many cases looked worse than a car that had been parked outside a dodgy Logan train station for a few nights too many, and somehow managing to get them operational again. Indicators that's going on include new brigades receiving T-64 tanks, existing brigades receiving additional T-64 tanks, the T-64 becoming increasingly common in our data after an initial drop-off, as well as videos and images like this one appearing to show some older T-64s that have apparently been reactivated. Ukraine also established contracts with companies in Poland and the Czech Republic to assist in repairing, reactivating and modernising T-64s. That means we can't include Ukrainian repair capacity alone in our estimates. We have to factor in some other countries too. Now, since the Ukrainians haven't actually released numbers on how many T-64s have been reactivated, we need to stack a bunch of rough assumptions together if we're going to generate an estimate. But on the understanding that this is some true House of Cards, back-of-the-envelope arithmetic that's about as precise as dropping a boulder from a strategic bomber, let's have a go. Assuming that all main battle tanks in the Ukrainian military are lost at a rate roughly proportional to the number of that type of vehicle that's in service, our data seems to suggest that the T-64 made up a greater percentage of Ukrainian forces in the 2024 data than it did in 2023. In the absence of any spoiling factors then, like disproportionate attrition, you'd need to have considerably more T-64s entering the force than NATO tanks entering the force in order to expect that result. After all, if you double the number of NATO tanks, you'd also need to double the number of T-64s just to hold the ratios constant. To get a sense of what that implies then, the team at Oryx estimate that between January 2024 and January 2025, Ukraine received roughly 82 NATO-type tanks. And in both 2023 and 2024, the loss ratio between T-64s and NATO tanks was roughly 3-1. That would suggest that if over a given period Ukraine had an inflow of 82 NATO-type tanks, they'd need to bring an additional 246 repaired or reactivated T-64s into the force just to hold the ratios constant. That would suggest Ukraine's repairing or reactivating enough tanks to match about a sixth of estimated Russian output. Certainly not enough to match the Russians tank for tank, but combined with Allied supplies and given the loss ratios we've seen over the course of the war so far, certainly enough to significantly shift the overall supply picture. For example, if you look just at Ukraine's visually confirmed tank losses, apply that additional 20% loading, and offset it only with a third of the tanks captured from Russia, plus those believed to have already been delivered by various allies, and you end up with a chart showing more than 1,200 tanks lost against just over 1,000 resupplied. But if you add an additional 160 repairs and reactivations per year, I brought our estimate down by a third just to be conservative, you end up estimating a force that's grown by roughly 270 main battle tanks since February 2022, with some more still on the pipeline, with one of the biggest contributors being Ukraine's ability to draw on their own share of the Soviet equipment inheritance. And again, that fits the observed phenomenon of some Ukrainian units, like the 150th Mechanized, receiving newly modernised T-64s to equip their armoured components, rather than, for example, NATO or captured Russian tanks. Yes, it's always possible that Ukraine is prioritising the equipment of new brigades rather than the re-equipment of existing ones, but what seems much less likely is that they would be actively taking equipment away from active units in order to equip new ones. Again, suggesting that with main battle tanks, unlike a lot of other categories, Ukrainian production is actually a significant part of the equipment inflow. So where does that all leave us in terms of timelines and sustainability? If you keep that extra 20% loss premium, just as we did for Russia, then over the last 2 years, Ukraine's been losing somewhere between 300 and 350 main battle tanks per year. If you assume Ukraine continue to repair or reactivate about 160 T-64s per year, which I think is very much the lower end of the estimate, then you end up needing between 140 and 190 tanks to come from somewhere else in order to maintain the fleet size. That means if currently pledged tanks are delivered but no additional ones are announced, we should expect the Ukrainian tank force to start going backwards sometime in 2026. But just to show how sensitive projections can be when you're talking about numbers this low with this level of uncertainty, If you instead assume 240 repairs and reactivations per year, which is the number we came up with earlier, and base the loss rate just on 2024, not 2023 and 2024, then you end up with the tank force being able to hold on until early 2028 before it starts to go backwards, which would hardly be a stunning success for Russia's stated goal of demilitarizing Ukraine. That said, just as I've noted when talking about Russian equipment levels in the past, there is a major difference between having enough tanks to keep up with your loss rate and having enough decent quality tanks to equip a much expanded military. The Ukrainian tank fleet of early 2025 being anywhere near the size it was back in February 2022 is hardly a stunning outcome for Russia. But given the sheer number of additional brigades and formations that have been added to the Ukrainian military over that time, it also implies that we'd see pretty much what we've been seeing. A lot of formations operating with well below the number of vehicles they'd have under ideal conditions. But the next question then is probably, if there isn't enough of this heavy stuff, the tanks and the IFVs, what do the Ukrainians have to equip a lot of their forces with? And part of the answer is lots and lots and lots of lighter armoured vehicles. For example, the data has Ukraine losing about 730 APCs since February 2024. Adding 20% makes that about 870 losses, against a casual 3,580 resupplied, with 800 still in the pipeline. Net position, plus 3,542. Those MRAPs, mine-resistant and ambush-protected vehicles, like the US Max Pro or the Australian Bushmaster, which have proven themselves valuable for a variety of roles in Ukraine, where mines are not exactly an uncommon occurrence, match roughly 470 losses against 1,400 vehicles received and 230 still in the pipe. Net position, around 1,150. And if you just want to get around behind the lines, or charge directly towards Russian positions before whipping out your AT-4 as part of an assault action, there are also the infantry mobility vehicles, think things like the US Humvee. With the US having withdrawn from Afghanistan and being in the process of replacing the Humvee, they may have had a couple of these things lying around. And because obviously holding on to used cars you've paid off for too long is deeply un-American when you could instead go into debt to buy new ones, the US has been handing these things out around the globe like they're only one escalation tier above thoughts and prayers. At time of recording, Ukraine's visually confirmed IMV losses are pretty close to the figures for APCs, about 840, including that extra 20% loading. Against that, they're estimated to have received about 6,100 so far, with 1,200 still in the pipeline, for a net overall position of plus 6,488. In sheer quantitative terms then, it's two American designs that have become the Zerglings, if you like, of the Ukrainian equipment park. The Ukrainians have been promised roughly 2,000 across various models of the quintessential metal box, the American M113, against 359 visually confirmed losses in the Oryx database, and 304 according to the Russian site Lostarmour. Compared to things like the Bradley, the Marder, or even the BMP-2, M113 might not be a particularly desirable choice. But in a war where we've seen Russia reactivate and use BTRs designed in 1952, the M113 probably gets a passing mark, and was realistically the only Western APC available in the kind of numbers needed to get Ukraine anywhere close to the sheer number of armoured vehicles they realistically required. The other Zergling, as already mentioned, is the American Humvee, with the US pledging about 5,000 of the things, along with some other small contributions, like 28 from Luxembourg, meaning that per unit population, Luxembourg's actually provided about 2.8 times as many Humvees as the United States has. The Humvee obviously isn't meant to be a frontline assault vehicle against a dug-in peer or near-peer opponent, but in Ukraine, necessity has sometimes been the mother of invention, or at least some batshit crazy plans. So we've seen these things used for just about everything, from general utility transport to providing point-blank fire support during trench assaults. Again, not ideal, but then again this war passed the militarised golf cart stage a while ago. So if your vehicle's relatively fast, shrapnel resistant, and can carry a 50 cal or AGL, you're already coming out ahead of at least some of the competition. Slap that all together, and across the IMV, APC and MRAP category, you get this chart here. With a lot of this, frankly, being made up of vehicles that were considered obsolete or surplus to requirements, and which in some cases, countries would otherwise have had to actively pay in order to get rid of. But despite accounting for a relatively small percentage of Allied aid in dollar terms, the data suggests this has been a pretty significant part of how the Ukrainians have been able to make up the numbers, and making sure that where possible, they're giving their troops at least something to provide a degree of tactical mobility and some protection. As for timelines, given the sheer number of these things still in inventory around the globe, a very rough projection suggests the Ukrainians will probably run out of these things around the time the Germans run out of beer, the Texans run out of guns, and the Indians, Poms and Australians get together to propose a global ban on cricket. More seriously, at an annual loss rate above 800 across the three categories, It would take the better part of 3 years to chew through what remains in the pipeline, and then perhaps 14 or so to go through whatever's already been sent. The situation isn't equal across each of the vehicle types. The MRAP pipeline is by far the shortest, but I think the overall supply picture is clear enough. A Ukrainian military that's been getting a lot of extra mobility as the war has gone on, in exchange for getting a lot lighter. So from an equipment category where supplies are generally holding up fairly well, let's pivot to one where they're a little more endangered, the aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force. Through 2024, a lot of the sorties flown by Ukrainian fast jet pilots appear to have fallen into one of two broad categories: air defense missions, hunting things like incoming cruise missiles and one-way attack drones, and ground attack sorties using munitions that usually have at least some standoff range. And most of those missions are still being flown by old Soviet types: Sukhoi 27, MiG-29, and Sukhoi 24, with that latter aircraft being particularly notable as Ukraine's Storm Shadow carrier of choice. After a long delay, however, Ukraine has now started to receive its first Western types, the F-16, and we've slowly seen these begin to get introduced primarily in the interior air defense role, hunting cruise missiles and drones. But even though a lot of aircraft, especially F-16s, have been pledged to Ukraine, the fact that it's taking so long to operationalise them, train the pilots, train the ground crews, prepare the infrastructure, etc., means that the estimated current and future stock of operational Ukrainian airframes looks very different from some other equipment categories. Assuming, of course, that our loss data is accurate, so let's have a look. If you thought the official overclaiming problem was bad when it came to tanks or IFVs, when it comes to aircraft, things are on entirely another level. Overall, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims to have destroyed more than 600 Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft since the war began, enough to imply the Ukrainians now have the only air force in the world to be entirely crewed by zombies. And yet, despite apparently having destroyed the entire Ukrainian air force in 2022, the Russians always seem to find more aircraft to shoot down, both their own and Ukrainian. There was even a period in October 2023 where the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have shot down 17 Ukrainian MiG-29s in 10 days. And so for this systems category, even more than normal, we're going to stick to the VC databases. And while they show considerably fewer Ukrainian aircraft losses than the Konashenkov daily, given the size of the Ukrainian pre-war force, it's still a pretty brutal picture. Ukraine's believed to have lost more than 50 fixed-wing aircraft in 2022, a lot of those during the first days and weeks of fighting. That was especially true during the earliest days where Russian aircraft were still flying missions deep into Ukrainian airspace and getting into air combats with Ukrainian aircraft. Once the line stabilised and both sides' air defence systems started to zone the opposing air force out, loss rates dropped considerably, with Ukraine taking fewer visually confirmed losses in 2023 and 2024 combined than during that first year. That's still a grand total of 102 planes, however, which is a pretty big ask for a pre-war force of Ukraine's size. If we just look at visually confirmed losses against committed resupply from Ukraine's various allies, it would look like Ukraine's air fleet underwent a kind of brutal U-shape. Many of their losses occurred in 2022, before any of their allies officially began to send Ukraine airframes. Then in 2023, eventually, the situation took a hard U-turn. Allied commitments of almost 100 aircraft for Ukraine, including those that would be broken down for spare parts, outnumbered visually confirmed losses by almost 5-1. And then again in 2024, at least on paper, the recovery continued, roughly 40 aircraft being committed against just over 20 being lost. And once again, that's without factoring in reactivations, which is particularly important for Ukraine's fleet of Sukhoi 24 Fencers. We've done the analysis of the Sukhoi 24 fleet before, so I won't repeat it this episode, but the spark notes are basically this. Ukrainian visually confirmed losses of Su-24s account for the vast majority of the pre-war operational fleet. But, as you may have noticed from the fact the Storm Shadows continue to fly and the Russians continue to claim to destroy more Sukhoi 24s, any tales of the demise of the Fencer fleet have been greatly exaggerated. The missing factor is that in February 2022, Ukraine had dozens of Sukhoi 24 airframes in storage, and through a combination of cannibalization and mechanical magic, appear to have gotten a significant number of them operational, to the point where in an interview, one Ukrainian officer in a Sukhoi 24 unit claims they have more flying now in their unit than they did in February 2022. Whether or not that's an exaggeration, we know a considerable number still need to be active because of the scale of some of the Storm Shadow strikes we see. If a strike involves 8 missiles being launched, for example, we know at least 4 aircraft need to have been involved. This might be one explanation for why we've sometimes seen Russia use very expensive and valuable long-range weapons, like cruise missiles, to attack retired or inactive airframes that any scan of the satellite data would show you haven't moved in years. The logic may have gone that sure, the aircraft itself isn't operational, but it might still be worth destroying just in case there are still any useful components aboard that could be used to reactivate or repair other ones. Based on what we've seen from the Sukhoi 24 fleet and other parts of the Ukrainian Air Force over time, I'd probably give a very rough, low-confidence estimate of somewhere between 10 and 24 Ukrainian aircraft being reactivated since February 2022. Also, with some of that being achieved through cannibalization, I'd suggest that on average, for every reactivation, Ukraine likely had to consume, for lack of a better word, more than one stored airframe. Throw that all into a chart, and you get something that looks like this. A Ukrainian Air Force that's lost a little over 120 aircraft, 102 visually confirmed, plus a 20% loading for imputed losses, wear and tear, etc., and which has managed to make up just over half of that between aircraft that have already been delivered or those that have been reactivated from storage. Then there is still this very large pool of committed but not yet delivered resupply, overwhelmingly F-16s but with a couple of other planes like Mirage 2000s tossed in, that on paper should be enough to make up all of the losses Ukraine has already suffered, and then some. Also, given the F-16 is generally considered to be a better aircraft than a lot but not all of the Ukrainian aircraft that it would be replacing in service, this might represent a positive trend for the Ukrainians in terms of quality, not just quantity. However, even more than with other categories, there are a couple of caveats there. Firstly, it's not entirely clear how effectively Ukraine can continue to maintain the older aircraft it has, as well as absorb newer F-16s. We've talked in the past about some of the challenges the Russians are probably facing in terms of airframes aging out faster than they can be replaced. And while Ukraine's airframes might generally not have to fly as many hours as their Russian equivalents, they're also on average older, meaning the task of keeping them flying as the war goes on is going to be ever more daunting. It was also major news in the Ukrainian media recently that the Ukrainian Air Force was due to transfer many personnel, including specialists like MiG-29 maintainers, over to the ground forces. We then saw the public and personal intervention of President Zelensky to prohibit those kind of transfers of specialist personnel taking place. But combined with the challenge of training up ground crews capable of maintaining the frankly much more picky F-16, I think it's an open question of just how quickly the Ukrainian Air Force would be able to re-expand, even if all the airframes were suddenly available. And of course, they won't all suddenly be available, because some of the aircraft are going to go through modernisation first, or be retained in other countries for training purposes, or just have the kind of delivery timelines you might expect from military bureaucracies still mostly operating on a peacetime basis. At a big picture level though, at least when it comes to airframe inventory, the Ukrainian Air Force might already be, or at least close to, its low point. It degraded pretty quickly in the early war when it was taking a lot of losses and receiving exactly 0 replacements, but now has a pretty strong pledged pipeline of replacements that have already started arriving in small numbers. F-16 isn't arriving early enough or in large enough numbers to help Ukraine win the air war, but it might be arriving soon enough to prevent the Ukrainians losing it. Basically, the Russians in the rigor of war did a fairly good job of wearing down the original pre-war Ukrainian Air Force, only for Ukraine's various allies to turn around and promise to give them another Air Force, a better Air Force, that Air Force, but only on a timescale that's still very much playing out. And while the number of airframes available to the Ukrainian Air Force might currently be at a low ebb, there is one area where there has been unambiguous improvement since February 2022. Not the aircraft themselves, but the munitions available to them. When the invasion began, Ukraine's Air Force couldn't launch cruise missiles. Now it can. It didn't have anti-radiation missiles for fire against Russian air defences. Now it does. Many ground attack missions had to be flown using unguided rockets with a limited range. Now a lot of that role is being filled by much more accurate, longer-ranged and more damaging glide and rocket-propelled bombs. Finally, while especially in the early air battles, Ukrainian pilots struggled with the fact that Russian pilots had access to long-range fire-and-forget air-to-air missiles, R-77 and R-37, they were stuck with semi-active Soviet-era systems that required them to keep their aircraft pointed at the target until the missile finally made impact. With the introduction of the F-16 though, Ukraine now has a way of firing the AIM-120 AMRAAM and the shorter-ranged AIM-9 Sidewinder. And of course there are other tools we've seen used, like air-launched decoys. Obviously none of these are silver bullets to address Ukraine's very real battlefield challenges. But I think it's important to note the qualitative improvement in the weapons available over time, and the way the availability of those systems might complicate Russian operations. In terms of timelines then, if on paper loss trends continue as they have, then the Ukrainians are probably in a much better position with their fighter aircraft pipeline than they are in some other system categories like IFVs. The number of pledged aircraft is enough to cover very roughly 3 years of losses at recent rates, provided of course that all of those aircraft are actually delivered, along with the supplies and weapons necessary to sustain them. On the other hand, this also assumes there are no additional aircraft reactivated from Ukrainian inventory and no future pledges of additional deliveries. So there are very much unknowns on both the upside and downside of the prediction. Whatever the case may be though, it does appear the Ukrainian Air Force is now in the midst of an almost irreversible transition. It went into this war with a Soviet-era fighter fleet, and it will almost certainly end it with a NATO one. Now, we could keep going through additional categories, but I think by now you probably get the picture. And instead, it's probably more valuable to zoom out a bit and give some big picture observations. Based on the data we put together today, Ukraine has a pretty mixed equipment picture going into 2025. There are categories like APCs and MRAPs that have gone through expansive growth. Russian strategic bombing may have succeeded in making the lives of many Ukrainians miserable, but it doesn't appear to have stopped the Ukrainians repairing, reactivating, or building from scratch hundreds of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled guns, and even aircraft. In other cases, the quantitative situation might not be that great, but average quality might be increasing. One of the things that stands out to me, though, is that in some of those categories you might pay the most attention to, like infantry fighting vehicles, looking at pain points in late 2025 or going into 2026, were very similar to some of the Russian pain points we calculated around late 2025 or into 2026. That suggests a scenario where Russia is likely to maintain its materially advantaged position, as it has throughout the war, but where the question of whose inventory really starts to break down first remains up in the air. That said, in a lot of those cases, I think there's a danger in focusing too much on that burn rate as compared to the pipeline, because forces can be dependent on critical resources that might run down far faster than the overall supply of vehicles. If new foreign assistance to Ukraine ceased to be pledged, for example, the country probably wouldn't run out of all military supplies at the same time. Based on what we've seen in the past with freezes in US aid, munitions would probably become a problem first. Then you'd likely start to see Western systems in particular start to break down for lack of spare parts and support long before the entire fleets were destroyed on the battlefield. This is part of why shipments of spare parts, munitions and consumables are so important, not just shipments of fully built systems. With the UK recently pledging to deliver another 150 artillery barrels being a clear example of this. I also think it's important to note, especially in the context of an upcoming change in the US administration, that while problems might not start to appear immediately if new aid announcements stop, by the time those issues do start to appear, it might be very difficult to solve them quickly. We were reading articles about the US approving shipments of F-16 to Ukraine more than a year before Ukraine actually got its first F-16s. And so if you come to the conclusion that Ukraine desperately needs more aircraft or infantry fighting vehicles in order to maintain its military capacity, pressure Russia, and shape negotiations to its advantage, then you better hope you made the decision to actually ship those supplies several months earlier. Otherwise, the Ukrainians might be in for a very difficult and painful wait. At a big picture level, though, to radically oversimplify the situation, if we compare the Russian and Ukrainian equipment position in January 2025, a broad observation would probably be that Russia has done a better job keeping up with quantitative requirements. Ukraine has done a better job with qualitative requirements. That is, how much of the force is made up of modern material as compared to in February 2022, with the major question being whether Ukraine will continue to receive more support from its allies long enough for Russia to exhaust what's left of its old Soviet inheritance. Overall, however, the availability of heavy equipment probably isn't Ukraine's most pressing potential point of failure. The country has nowhere near as much modern heavy equipment as it would likely like, but then again, neither does Russia. And from a Ukrainian perspective, I'd probably identify potential issues like manpower and munition shortages or organisational issues as more pressing than the heavy equipment problem. Because there, we appear to be in a position where, despite the Russians bashing against the Ukrainian force for the better part of 3 years, Ukraine's overall equipment picture probably isn't that radically removed from when they started. There are fewer Soviet IFVs, but more Western APCs. Fewer Soviet-era aircraft, but the start of a flow of replacement NATO systems, an air defence system that's had to partially transition over NATO munitions during a war, and a tank and artillery force that's undergoing strain and transformation at the same time. More equipment would obviously help from a Ukrainian perspective, especially in very difficult areas like the fighting in the Donbass. But as we've discussed in the past, the battlefield dynamics there probably come down to a lot more than just a count of armoured vehicles. It's vitally important to acknowledge, however, that all of those projections rest on the reliability of our data. But likewise, because we've used very similar methodologies calculating losses and making projections for both the Russians and the Ukrainians, even if an issue in the assumptions threw off the raw numbers, it might not do much to actually shift the balance. To illustrate that, let's take one example: the question of imputed losses, serviceability, and equipment readiness. Basically flagging there can be a significant difference between the amount of equipment you have on your books that hasn't actually been destroyed yet, and the percentage of that equipment that's actually fully mission capable and available for frontline use. And in this respect, both Russia and Ukraine might be sitting on a time bomb of sorts. Today, we tried to partially capture the effect of equipment wearing out, breaking down, or being lost in accidents with that 20% loading on the visually confirmed losses. And I did that because it's the figure we used in the episode on Russian losses and reserves. But it was always meant to be a very, very conservative value, mostly out of a desire to give the Russians the benefit of the doubt when it came to the rate they were burning through their equipment stockpiles. The other issue, though, is not only is that 20% probably too low in a lot of cases, we also have reason to suspect that the actual rate wouldn't be static over time. because, shockingly enough, spare parts and wear and tear issues tend to aggregate over time. There are new cars out there, for example, that might feel frankly indestructible when you first buy them, but slap enough kilometres on the odometer and the only safe place to drive the thing will be in laps around your local mechanic. As the war has gone on, both Ukraine and Russia are putting a lot more hours on systems that in many cases are decades old. That can lead to situations where repair and serviceability is a constant challenge, especially in cases where there may not actually be any kind of stable spare parts supply. Ukraine's going to struggle, for example, to get spare parts for a lot of the Russian systems it's captured, while some of the older relics we've seen Russia reactivate from storage don't actually have an active production and support system left anywhere in the world. So I think it's fair to suggest that over time, all else being equal, the combat power of these fleets might drop faster than their total inventory of systems on paper, and a 20% imputed loss rate might be too low. But even if the actual number was twice that high, the problem affects both sides, even if not to exactly equivalent extents. So even if our overall numbers were to shift, our picture of the overall balance and trends might still be comparatively accurate. In trying to look forward then, we need to acknowledge there are a lot of things that we're taking for granted. Consistent intensity of the fighting, constant loss ratios, consistency in aid inflows, and the sustainability of Ukraine's production and reactivation efforts. If we're willing to make those assumptions though, there are probably a couple of projections we can make for 2025. Firstly, that domestically produced Ukrainian hardware, like the Bodana self-propelled gun, will become increasingly important as a share of the force. The claim by Zelensky is that earlier in the war, domestic Ukrainian production accounted for less than 10% of supplies to the military, and now the number is closer to 33%. The second is that vehicles captured from the Russians, but with no Ukrainian or Allied supply line, will probably start to drop out of the force as maintenance becomes increasingly difficult. Then, assuming aid announcements and deliveries continue, we should see more of a transition of the force towards more and more NATO kit. Beyond that, most things are uncertain. The Ukrainians and Russians are locked in a battle of attrition that so far doesn't have a decisive winner. Ukraine is dealing with manpower and other resource issues, while also struggling to stop Russia slowly grinding forward at certain points along the front, while Russia's once seemingly infinite pool of old stored Soviet equipment now seems very much finite, even as the expenditures necessary to support arms production or attract new personnel into the armed forces continue to escalate. Drone strikes against targets deep in the Russian rear continue to grow in size, and the arms race between sanctions and sanctions evasion continues to play out. Only time will tell which of the challenges both sides now face becomes a critical breaking point first. And okay, channel update to close out. Firstly, thank you for your patience with this episode. When I originally did the video on Russian equipment reserves, the intention was always to follow up with one on the Ukrainian position, but I figured the right time to do that update would be right before the change in US administration. That, I think, gives us the best possible snapshot of where things currently stand at the end of the Biden administration, while also leaving room open to discuss any changes to our projections that might follow from any major shifts in policy in the coming weeks and months. In terms of broader updates, patrons, there should be a post up for you by the time this video does go live. But for those of you waiting on the Purring Gaming content, you might be waiting just a little longer. There was an attempt to record something this week, but it fell victim to the good old robo-voice problem, which, because I wasn't checking my recording as I went, I didn't notice until it was far too late. If at all possible, I'll try and have another go tomorrow. There are a couple of other topics that might deserve an update, but I'm going to park them for an extra week or two just until things settle. And so for the moment, let me just thank you all again for your support and engagement of the channel, and I hope to see you all again next week.